Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S MindLab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the way you do an experiment actually changes the results you get? That is the big question we're tackling today. So, psychologists and scientists are always looking for new ways to understand how our brains work, especially when we're reading and understanding sentences. For a long time, the best way to do this was in a carefully controlled lab. Think about it, you have comfy chairs, no distractions, and everyone's doing exactly what you want them to do. But lately, there has been a huge shift towards doing experiments online using websites and platforms. This is great because it lets researchers gather data from tons of people way faster and cheaper. But a really important question pops up: are the results we get from these online experiments the same as the results we get from the lab? Does doing an experiment on your couch at home change how your brain behaves compared to sitting in a quiet lab? This is exactly what our researchers wanted to find out. They took a specific experiment that studies how we understand tricky sentences called garden path sentences. You know, those sentences that sound a little weird at first, and then you have to reread them to get the right meaning. Like the teacher brought the assignments was not looking forward to grading them. Your brain first thinks the teacher brought the assignments, but then it realizes the teacher was the one who was brought the assignments. This temporary confusion, this little garden path your brain goes down, actually makes you read the confusing part a bit slower. Scientists call this a garden path effect. They decided to test this by running the same exact experiment on 4 different platforms. First, they had people do it in the lab using something called SONA-lab. Then, they had students from the same university take the same experiment online using SONA-online. Finally, they reached out to 2 popular online platforms, Prolific and Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk. They wanted to see if the size of the garden path effect, meaning how much slower people read those confusing sentences, was the same across all these different places. And here is the big reveal. They found that consistently the garden path effect was larger in the lab than on any of the online platforms. This means people showed more of that reading slowdown in the lab than they did when taking the experiment online. It's like the brain was a bit more tricked by the garden path sentences when it was in the controlled lab environment. They also looked at other factors that affect reading speed, like how common a word is or where it appears in a sentence. And guess what? They saw a similar pattern. The effects of word frequency and word position were also weaker on the web-based platforms compared to the lab. This suggests that it is not just the specific garden path effect that is different, but several fundamental aspects of reading might be measured differently depending on where you do the experiment. So, what does this all mean? It means the platform you use can actually change the size of the effects you measure. If you are trying to make precise predictions about how our brains work, like how much exactly a certain factor will slow down reading, then it really matters whether your data comes from a lab or from an online platform. The lab results in this case seem to show a stronger, clearer effect. The researchers point out that while online platforms are amazing for getting lots of data, especially for understanding if something affects processing, they might be less reliable for understanding how much it affects processing. If your goal is to test exact numbers and predictions, you might be getting a more conservative estimate of the effect size when you use online platforms. Now, why might this be happening? The study looked into it. One obvious suspect is distractions. When they asked people about distractions, more people reported them in the online SONA group compared to the lab. However, even when people didn't report distractions online, the effects were still weaker. This leads them to think it might be more than just obvious noise. This is a really key finding because the SONA-online group, which used the same students as the SONA-lab group, but did it online, also showed smaller effects. It suggests the testing environment itself plays a role. Maybe people are just less focused, less engaged, or more prone to multitasking when they're doing an experiment at home, compared to a dedicated lab session. Even if they aren't consciously aware of distractions, their overall attention might be lower. The study also touched on whether Prolific is better than MindTurk. They found that when they filtered MindTurk participants for quality using the master's qualification, the results looked pretty similar to Prolific. But getting those quality MindTurk participants was a real pain, much harder than recruiting on Prolific, which was much smoother and faster. So while the data quality might be comparable for highly qualified MTurk users, Prolific seems to be way easier to work with. What are the big takeaways here? Well, if you are a researcher and you are interested in whether something affects behavior, online platforms are still super useful, as long as you have enough participants to be sure your results aren't just a fluke. But if you are trying to measure exactly how much something affects behavior, you need to be really careful. The lab might give you a clearer picture of the effect under ideal conditions. This research highlights that we can't just assume data collected online is identical to data collected in a lab. The testing environment matters, and it can subtly change how people engage with the task, leading to different effect sizes. For anyone building models of language processing or cognition, this means they need to be really clear about what kind of data their models are trying to match ideal lab conditions or more typical online setting. One of the limitations here is that while they found that the platform matters, they couldn't definitively say exactly why across all platforms. They suspect it is a mix of environmental factors like distractions and maybe even individual differences in attention or motivation that are harder to control online. Future studies could really dig into measuring these factors more precisely. So, the next time you see a study done online, it is good to remember that while it is making research more accessible, it might be giving us a slightly different picture of cognitive effects than we'd see in a lab. It's a fascinating puzzle that shows how deeply our environment can influence our minds. What do you guys think about this? Does it surprise you that the location of the experiment could change the results so much? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into psycholinguistics, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S MindLab for more science breakdowns. Well, see you in the next one.